Chapter 13, Grandma. A car pulled up and stopped in front of the house, gravel crunching beneath its tires. I picked up my coat and walked inside for a drink of water, and as I drained the glass, Grandma walked through the front door. I set the glass on the counter and walked into the living room to meet her. The sight that met my eyes startled me. Grandma looked older than I had ever seen her. She moved slowly and carefully, her head hanging low. She was in her mid-70s, but I had never really thought of her as old until right now. She always seemed so youthful, so energetic and warm. The image of her I carried in my mind was of her holding hands with Grandpa, laughing together or singing around the old piano on Christmas Eve. I repressed the initial urge to run forward and shout, "Surprise!" and paused in the doorway instead. "Merry Christmas, Grandma," I said gently. She startled slightly and looked up. Suddenly a spark ignited in her eyes. "Spencer!" She stepped forward, her head up now, the old familiar energy restored. "You're early! Has your whole family come?" I breathed a little sigh of relief to see her back to her old self. "Nope, just me, Gram." By this time, our arms were around each other and squeezing tight. I breathed another sigh of relief as I noted how hard she could still squeeze. Maybe she had only looked old for a moment. Maybe I had nothing to worry about. "So," she said as she stepped back and looked me over, "what brings you here so early?" I had forgotten all about planning my story. It seemed ridiculous now. Anyway, as long as it was the truth, it was good enough for Grandma. "Actually, I just felt like it." Grandma smiled at this, and I watched warm tears well up in her eyes. "Well, I certainly am happy to see you. Thank you for coming." "I'm glad I did. You'll have to tell me all about your classes and friends." She emphasized friends just enough to imply girlfriends as well. "There's not much to tell," I confessed, "but I do have a date tonight. We're going to the high school play." "A date?" she asked, looking surprised. "Who's the lucky girl?" "Her name's Annetta. She works at the diner by the highway." "Oh, Annetta Hall. She is a very sweet girl. I didn't know you knew her," she said, knitting her brow slightly. "Well, we just met, actually. I stopped there on my way through town. What do you know about her?" "Oh, she's simply wonderful. You two will get along just fine. I imagine she'll rather enjoy having someone her age to talk to." Grandma looked at me thoughtfully for a moment, and I wondered if she was imagining Annetta and I as a couple. "It's too bad," Grandma began, then stopped. "What?" I asked curiously. "Nothing," Grandma answered, waving off whatever she was about to say. "I shouldn't spoil anything by telling you what she can tell you better herself. By the way," she added, "does your family know you've come?" When I paused, she added, "I'll give them a call. You'd better get ready." Chapter 14, Courage. Annetta was nowhere to be seen through the glass windows of Becca's diner as I pulled up outside a few minutes early. I sat in my car until 1:45, then walked inside. I stepped up to the bar where I had ordered lemonade that afternoon, and a lanky cook glanced up at me. He looked about 20, and his white apron seemed like it hadn't been washed for at least the last 500 greasy hamburgers. His cowboy boots echoed on the tile floor as he stepped toward me behind the bar. "What can I get you?" he asked. "Oh, I'm just waiting for Annetta," I answered. "Looks like she's not here yet." The boy just stared back without responding. For a moment, I thought he hadn't understood, but then I noticed the way he glared at me. It seemed like a combination of sizing me up and staring me down. His eyes narrowed a bit, and he pursed his lips off to one side. It felt like some kind of challenge, and I wondered if this was Annetta's boyfriend. That could explain Grandma's little secret that she hadn't told me. The boy gave no sign of talking, so I took the middle road and retreated without backing down. I stared back steadily for a moment, giving no sign that I was even aware of the challenge, then looked around at the booths away from the bar and said, "I'll just wait for her over here." "She ain't working tonight," the boy said flatly. "Yeah," I said, "I know. We're going to the play in a few minutes. If this was my competition, I may as well get it out in the open." I took a seat across from the door, looked around the room, then out the window. In the reflection on the glass, I watched the door open and Annetta walk in and look around for me. I turned toward her just as the cook caught her eye. "Hey, Netta," he said, slow and drawn out, as if he really meant to say, "Who is this guy? What's going on here?" "Hey, Jim," she answered casually, then saw me and walked over. "What's up, Spencer? You ready?" "All set," I answered, standing up. I wondered what sort of waves my appearance was causing and what minor melodramas I might be stepping into. All right then, she said, tilting her head toward the door. Let's go. Bye, Jim, she said as we walked past the bar. Jim didn't answer. I sensed his glare even after the door closed behind us. Annetta had taken her light brown hair out of the ponytail and curled the ends under. Her tanned sheepskin coat looked warm and new and like it had seen more time on Rodeo Drive than in the saddle. Her pastel blue t-shirt, together with jeans and light hiking shoes, gave her a comfortable, down-to-earth look. Annetta glanced up at me as we stepped off the curb and flashed a quick smile. Wow, I thought to myself, she's really cute. She didn't have Julie's perfect features and flawless skin, but I found her slender figure and simple, wholesome, girl-next-door appearance quite attractive. With that thought, my old insecurities came rushing back. I felt intimidated. The old pressure to be cool, the need to impress her, and the fear that I'd say something stupid made it impossible for me to say anything at all. I wanted to be audacious and say, "You look great," but the words got stuck in my throat. I pulled my car keys from my pocket and stepped toward the passenger door, still reaching for something to say. "Let's walk," Annetta said. "It's only a couple blocks." "Sounds great." "So what do you do, Spencer?" Annetta asked. "I'm going to school at Utah State." I felt slightly relieved to have the silence broken. "Really? What's your major?" she continued. Her voice was light and carefree. Everything about her felt alive and happy. She almost skipped as she walked. It's English, but I'm looking into some other majors." I suddenly didn't like the sound of my own voice. It sounded drab and boring compared to her lively inflection. "Really? Like what?" "I don't know. I thought about philosophy for a little while, but I've sort of lost interest in it." "Why?" I looked over at Annetta. She met my gaze and waited for my answer as she skipped along next to me. I guess it's just because I took this class and sort of realized that philosophers don't really know all that much." "Oh," she simply replied. "I mean, sure, they know stuff," I continued, feeling a little defensive, "but it's like they're missing lots of stuff too. Or like, even if you study all those ideas, it doesn't really make that much difference in your life." She said. I guess she was just making small talk. I shouldn't have given such a long answer to her question. I'd be more careful from now on. Before I could throw in a question of my own and change the subject and get her to do more of the talking, she asked, "So what does make a difference?" "I don't know. That's what I'm sort of stuck on. What do you think?" "Let's see," she replied, pausing momentarily. "I'd have to say courage." It didn't sound much like philosophy, but it caught my interest. "Oh?" I asked. "How so?" "Well," she explained, "if you have courage, then it changes not only what you do, but how you do it. It makes everything better." I liked her idea instantly. I didn't know why, but it sounded right. As a matter of fact, it sounded more useful than anything I had studied all semester long. "Where did you learn that?" I asked. "I don't know," she answered. "I just figured it out somewhere along the way." We crossed a small bridge, and I saw the school just down the block. "Would you say courage is the meaning of life?" I asked, wondering if I could resolve my whole question right here, one day too late for the paper assignment. "I don't know if I'd go that far," Annetta answered, "but it probably adds some meaning to life." "Well, it sounds a lot more useful than existentialism or nihilism or any of that stuff." "Yeah," Annetta answered. "I see what you mean now. Getting analytical and abstract about life doesn't automatically translate into meaningful actions and feelings. I thought Maslow's hierarchy of needs was pretty insightful, though, but that's more psychology than philosophy, isn't it?" How did she know about Maslow? I began to realize I didn't know the first thing about this girl. "Did you just figure that out along the way, too?" She laughed and answered, "No, I got that one in school." "Where'd you go?" "San Diego State," she answered. "I just finished up this summer." "Oh, yeah? What was your major?" I asked, relieved to note that our conversation was gaining some momentum and discovered that perhaps we had more in common than I thought. "Philosophy," she said, looking at me with one eyebrow raised playfully, then added, "Just kidding." She laughed a little and looked up toward the stars, already beginning to appear in the evening sky, then down toward the darkening horizon. I watched her green eyes, and they danced as she continued. "It was liberal arts and sciences, so I got a little of everything. I like it that way." "Yeah? Like what?" Annetta thought for a moment, then looked me in the eye to answer casually. "Everything," she said. "I guess because awareness of anything makes it more interesting because you know how to appreciate it. Like biology and humanities and psychology, the more you know about them, the more exciting and meaningful everything becomes." It wasn't just what Annetta said, but the way she said it made her ideas feel fresh and interesting. Her underlying interest in the world spilled out with her ideas and flavored them like raspberry vinaigrette dressing poured over a salad. "What do you like about majoring in English?" Annetta asked. I thought for a moment and didn't think of any profound answers. "I like it better than anything else I've found," I said. "Why?" She wasn't going to let me off easy. "I like the discussions we have about the readings," I answered, "and writing papers most of the time. It seems like analyzing stories and applying them to our own circumstances helps make more sense of life sometimes." "Always looking for the meaning of life, huh?" "I guess so," I said. I had never thought of it that way before, but now the pattern seemed blatantly obvious. "What have you found out about it so far?" Annetta asked. She looked me in the eye again, and I could read her genuine curiosity about the topic. As long as she was interested in me and my thoughts, I guess it wasn't so bad for me to be doing most of the talking instead of her. I hadn't found out anything useful in my philosophy paper, but maybe my old English papers held some clues. Dozens of ideas sprang to mind, but none of them conclusive. None of them could summarize the meaning of meaning itself. "It seems to change for every character and situation," I finally answered, which would explain why everyone finds the meaning of life so elusive. Annetta thought out loud. "I think we're dealing with two different questions here. In the first place, there's the definition of the meaning of life, and then there's the application of it so life feels meaningful." I nodded my head and wished we had had this conversation 2 months earlier before spending so much time in futile research for my paper. Now we just need some research questions. "Like, what makes life feel meaningful?" I asked. The street lamp above our heads flickered on, and Annetta looked up at me and gave a confident smile in response without even nodding, as if the answer was too obvious to waste any words or energy on. I began to fall in love with the idea that our conversation could jump right past all the formalities, all the trivial details, all the banal observations, all the worrying about being good enough, and skip straight to the important, interesting, useful points. The challenge of talking with Annetta reminded me of ski, except that Annetta's discussion invited exploration, while ski instigated contests, a team effort rather than a battle of wits. I also began to feel something I had hardly experienced since I was a child. It was the feeling of waking up early every morning and wondering what grand adventure I would discover that day. The anticipation of feeling the wind blow through my hair, of tasting the humid morning air in my lungs, the salty blood pumping through my veins as I ran. The impression that every door was open to me, that every barrier was nothing more than a playground toy to scramble over, that life was for living, and every thought was a possibility. I quickly recognized the basis of this new feeling: curiosity. Curiosity about every aspect of life, opening my eyes wide to the world around me, opening my heart and mind to experience and understanding. I had naturally known this curiosity as a child, but had largely inadvertently abandoned it through neglect, through fears about whether or not I was accepted or good enough, and through a shortage of friends who understood why everything matters so much. I had smothered it under the demands of keeping up with school and work and the expectations I felt from everyone around me. I had nearly forgotten how it felt and how much I loved and missed this sensation. Now it all came rushing back, rising slowly into my mind like the surge of high tide creeping steadily up the beach, and my self-awareness surprised me. As Annetta looked confidently up at me, I felt like we shared a common bond, a secret pact that no one else could see or understand. I felt excited to get to know her better and perhaps figure out why this girl and the curiosity she awoke in me had begun to make life feel meaningful. "You know what, Annetta?" I said, stopping as we reached the school parking lot. "I still don't know the first thing about you. Would you just start at the beginning or in the middle or anywhere and tell me all about yourself?" "Hey," she answered, stopping to face me. "I don't know anything about you either. When are you going to take your turn?" "Right after you, I promise." Annetta considered this for a moment, cocking her head to one side with her hair falling partly across her face, then assented. "Well, I suppose the middle is as good a spot to start as anywhere," she began. "How do you know what's the middle?" "As long as it's not the beginning or the end, it must be the middle," she explained. I nodded, and she continued. "Winter's beautiful, but I prefer summer." I loved the chance this gave me to just look at her, to watch the way she walked and listen to the passion for life evident in her voice. I watched the sparkle in her bright green eyes and the way her lips moved over her teeth. I noticed the locals as they drove past us to park or walked in groups toward the door, the way they all craned their necks and stared to see the new guy walking with Annetta. I bought a pair of tickets and we strolled into the auditorium. We sat off to one side and continued talking. Annetta had hardly begun her life summary when the pit orchestra began to play. We talked until the curtain rose, and out walked Tevye to introduce the play. Chapter 15, Chemistry. During intermission, Annetta and I wandered through the high school's narrow halls, talking until half a dozen kids running and playing tag nearly knocked us over. We stepped into a classroom then, filled with lab tables and half-set-up test tube experiments. We began our conversation by listing dozens of meaningful activities and ideas like play and work, food and sleep, family and friends, security and adventure. We observed how much our fears can interfere and how courage makes the difference by overcoming the barriers and finding meaning despite them. From there, we forgot our meaning of life research project and shared stories of our favorite life experiences. Annetta had a way of asking questions and following up with more questions that not only made me feel interesting, but brought out a depth that I wasn't accustomed to even thinking about. I could analyze other things just fine, but I had never turned such an analytical eye on myself. Not only that, but Annetta had a way of identifying the best parts of me and shining her light on them. She was like a magnet, finding treasure hidden beneath the sand and lifting it to the surface. I wondered if she had this effect on everyone, and whether the change was only mine, if she was a catalyst, inducing rapid change all around her, but experiencing none of the same for herself. When her turn to answer questions came, she needed no follow-up prompts. She told stories filled with vivid detail and insightful observations about life. Furthermore, her family had lived all over the world, and that supplied a wealth of experience and stories. "That's so great," I said, "that you've been so many places. Do people who haven't traveled so much ever seem boring to you?" "No," she said emphatically, "of course not. People can be so interesting for so many reasons. The most important thing, maybe the only important thing, is what they are or who they are on the inside. I mean, a lot of people travel all over, but they never let it get inside them, so it doesn't have any impact on them at all. What's the use of that?" "What impact does it have on you?" I asked. "What impact should it have?" Annetta thought for a moment. "Well, I don't know exactly. I think it has something to do with realizing what's out there. Yeah, I think that's it. It makes you realize that people are basically the same everywhere, that there's more than one good way to see the world and more than one good way to live your life, and whatever way you choose isn't necessarily right or wrong. Maybe that makes you appreciate differences more, or maybe it makes you appreciate what you've got more because it no longer seems ordinary. Or maybe," she paused again momentarily, "I think for me, it just gave me a feeling that there are no real boundaries in life or any limitations, you know? Like I can go anywhere and do anything I want. Does that make sense?" "Yeah," I answered, "it makes a lot of sense." It sounded so exciting, especially watching the way Annetta told it and seeing the obvious passion for life flash in her eyes. What else makes people interesting, on the inside? Gosh, just about any experience could do that, I think. Anything that stretches you, maybe, or, well, anything. And it probably depends a lot on who you are to begin with, way deep inside. And then on the way you're brought up, too, of course. Annetta stopped and looked me in the eye. "That's a big question," she said. "Just finish answering this one," I begged. "You can ask me a big one next." On some level, I realized that I was prodding Annetta because I hoped she would mention some trait that I had. I wanted some small reassurance that I had something to offer to this friendship, that she might be willing to spend more time together and not grow tired of me. "Okay," she assented. "Anyway, this is fun to talk about." Annetta took a quick, deep breath, preparing for her last exam question. "All right, what makes people interesting?" She thought for a second and then began. "This question is both hard and easy. I love when someone is aware of beauty, when they see it and it just fills them and they think they can't express it, but if you really see into them, you know exactly how they feel. That's easy because my best friend at school was like that. He stopped trying to explain it to people because he'd get so frustrated when they couldn't understand or appreciate it. I also love when people are kind. Not the cheesy, sweet, superficial way, though. Not when they say all the right things just because they're trying to please everyone. But when someone really cares deep down inside, they don't even have to say anything and you feel it and you understand. That's easy because my dad's like that. And I love when people are adventurous and brave. I love when they do whatever they want and say whatever they think and just dive into life because they love it so much and they're not afraid of the consequences. My little sister Amy's so much that way, it scares me. And some people think they're that way, but they really do what they want because they're selfish or afraid or I don't know what. They just don't do things because they love life, but because they're avoiding discomfort. And you can tell because they're wasting their lives, wasting time, doing drugs, hurting themselves and other people. That's the easy part of the question. The hard part is that there are so many other things I admire so much, but I can't think of them off the top of my head. Is that good enough? Absolutely. Listening to Annetta made me feel like someone had found the dial to turn up the amount of color in the world. Every sentence opened half a dozen ideas that I wanted to follow all the way till their ends. I watched her features, her hair, cheeks, nose, and teeth, and especially the way her eyes danced when she spoke. There seemed to be an energy pulsing around the edges of her green irises. "What's your favorite place you've ever lived?" I asked, forgetting my promise to let her ask the next question. Annetta had already listed all the places around the world her family had lived while growing up: England, Brazil, Hawaii, and various cities and towns spread out throughout the United States. Her father loved discovering new places and meeting people, and he used his career as a geologist to work alternately as a teacher or a research specialist for oil and gas companies, which gave plenty of opportunity for travel. "That's hard to say," she answered. "Partly because I was so young when we went half those places. Like in Brazil, I was 7, so I only remember my neighborhood and the American school and a few other images from markets and places we went often. I remember they had stores that only sold bananas, or only bread, or only something else." Annetta's eyes began to light up again as the images played through her mind. No matter how little she claimed to remember, the details in those memories remained vivid. Everything she said, even the mundane details, seemed interesting and important. I couldn't figure out why, so I kept listening and enjoying the way her sentences filled the space between us. "And we'd always make Mom buy silver bananas. We thought they were so cool. And the people were so nice. They'd always smile at us and talk to us. But of course, I had no idea what they were saying. I'm sure it was nice. It must have been strange seeing a couple blonde little American kids there. And I was so shy, I'd never talk to them or hardly even look at them. Except for the guy who worked at the candy store by the church half a block from our home. We'd take our allowance there and he'd always say, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. We got used to it and we'd say, 1, 2, 3, back to him. Once his son, who must have been about 12, walked down the street and started swearing at us in English. His father ran outside and started beating him. I felt bad for him then. And then Annetta's sentence trailed off and a distant look came into her eyes. A moment later, she looked up again and said, "I talk too much." "Not at all," I assured her, eager for her to continue. But her mood had changed. The conversation had lost its momentum, and I didn't know how to bring it back. "Intermission's over," Annetta said, standing up, "and Amy's big part is coming up. We'd better get back to our seats." I stood up and obediently followed her back to the auditorium. The play had already resumed, so I sat down next to Annetta in the back of the dark auditorium and wondered what Annetta wasn't telling me and how I could find out and what would happen next. Chapter 16, Wishes. Amy was a senior and played Hava, the youngest of Tevia's 3 older daughters. And as far as we were concerned, she stole the show. She seemed to have the same energy and confidence as Annetta, but with a careless impulsiveness tossed in. When Tevia sang the song about losing her, my favorite part of the play, Amy danced in the background so gracefully that I actually teared up. "Were you like that in high school?" I whispered. "No," Annetta whispered back. "I was too shy." The play ended, and the audience gave the cast a standing ovation. We milled around for a while afterward while I was introduced to what felt like half the town. Nearly everyone gave me a strange look that I couldn't quite interpret as we shook hands. It looked like a knowing smile, only I didn't know whatever it was they knew. After 5 or 6 people had given me the exact same look, I had a difficult time keeping myself from laughing. Annetta caught on too, and soon we couldn't help but laugh with nearly every introduction. No one seemed to mind. "What is that look about?" I asked when we had a moment alone. "I think they're checking you out to decide if they approve." "Watching out for you, eh? They must think very highly of you." Something like that. People can be kind of nosy around here. The cast stood in the lobby, shaking hands with the audience as they left, and once the crowds thinned, Amy walked toward us. "So you're Spencer, huh?" she asked, holding out her hand. "Netta told me about you." "You were awesome up there," I told her, shaking her hand and nodding toward the stage. She still wore her costume and thick stage makeup, but made it look good. "You were right, Annetta," she observed. "He is cute." Annetta's jaw dropped in astonishment at her sister's boldness. "I never said that," she protested. Amy just laughed. "Well, you certainly implied it," she countered. "Well," Annetta said, turning toward me, "you are very handsome." "Thanks," I answered, feeling suddenly awkward. "So, Spence," Amy began, "how do you like my big sister?" "Stop trying to embarrass him, Amy," Annetta cut in. Amy looked at her with a mischievous grin to see if she would really be in trouble if she didn't stop teasing. Annetta's face revealed no sign either way. "She's pretty great," I answered anyway. "Yep," Amy said. "You got that right. I better leave you two lovebirds alone now before I say something my sister will regret. Nice to meet you, Spencer." "You too," I answered. Amy curtsied and danced away to rejoin the other cast members. Annetta and I pulled on our coats and made our way outside, where the night had grown cold enough to make our breath stand out as white vapor. As we crossed the bridge on our way back to my car, Annetta stopped and leaned over the concrete railing. I stopped next to her and looked down into the black river. The nearly full moon reflected in the water, shimmering on rippled currents, dimming along the edges where the stream turned to ice. "What is it about lights," Annetta wondered out loud, "that draws us in like moths?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out a couple coins. "Want to make a wish?" I asked. Annetta took a dime from my hand and asked, "Who do you usually wish for, yourself or other people?" I hadn't thought about it much, I admitted, knowing that it had never occurred to me to make a wish for someone else. "What about you?" "I always wish for other people. It's more fun that way. You can get more creative." Annetta turned around and thought for a moment, then flipped the dime over her shoulder and waited to hear it plop into the stream. I turned around and thought for a moment, trying to think of something to wish for someone else, but couldn't think of anything more important than wishing that Annetta and I would become friends and that I would learn how to be more audacious and live a more meaningful life. I closed my eyes, flipped my coin into the river, and made another selfish wish. "I'm glad I met you, Spencer," Annetta said, cocking her head to one side. "Me too," I agreed, wondering why she said that. For a split second, a crazy thought crossed my mind. Does she like me? "I hadn't realized how restless I was feeling," Annetta explained, "with so few people to really talk to around here." That makes more sense, I thought. I'm just someone to talk to. Anyway, she had done most of the talking. How could she like me if I hadn't even said that much? "So thanks for asking me out," Annetta finished, looking up at me gratefully. I smiled and looked into her eyes, and suddenly it dawned on me. She doesn't see me. She doesn't know me. She doesn't realize that she's standing here thanking a nervous, shy, insecure kid with nothing to offer but a listening ear. She sees a possible friend, a peer, maybe even a man. She thinks we have things in common. She thinks she can talk to me on her level. But sensing Annetta see me this way had a surprising effect. I automatically began to see myself as she did. I felt stronger, smarter, and more interesting. And then I realized, maybe she's right. Maybe there's more to me than I knew, and I have been the blind one. And why not? Why not become more confident and outgoing and interesting? Why not rewrite my character right now? I was tired of playing the coward. That role got me nowhere, and I was tired of being nowhere. I would practice acting confidently until it became real. From now on, I would act audaciously and stop always assuming the worst. "My pleasure," I replied, still looking Annetta in the eye and feeling the solid new feeling surge inside. "Let's do it again soon." "Yeah," Annetta agreed, smiling happily. A cold breeze drifted downstream and made us turn away from the river. Annetta pulled her jacket tighter around her neck and shivered, and we both turned and walked back to the car. I unlocked the car door and let Annetta in, and we drove the 5 blocks to her home. I pulled up to the curb, and we stayed in the car with the engine and heater running off and on for another hour, talking about people we had known, things we had done, places she had gone, and things we each hoped for in the future. Finally, she glanced up at the clock on the dash. I'd better go. I'll call you tomorrow, I promised, and we can set up something fun. I don't work until 4, she offered. How about lunch? I proposed. I know this great diner in town named Becca's. Ever heard of it? I'm told everything on the menu is delish. Annetta laughed and shook her head. Please, no. The last thing I need to do is spend 10 hours at work tomorrow. Why don't I just drop by your place? 12 o'clock? Yeah, I'll be there. With that, Annetta reached over and gave my hand a squeeze, then opened her door and ran inside.